Please help me welcome Pat back.
Thanks. As we look at the economy of local areas around the state, I'm constantly reminded of the almost absurdity of having someone parachute in from Missoula and tell you about your economy, right? I mean, it's something that I seem to have gotten away with most of my career. And if I could just do it for a couple more years, you know, I'll be okay. But seriously, it is kind of useful sometimes to have somebody from the outside come in and say, okay, this is how you score, this is how you rank out. So it will be kind of a view from a higher altitude, shall we say. And I want to start with this first question, which is to say, what makes the economy tick? And I'm going to do that in a slightly different way. I did this last year as well. I updated these assessments. And that is, if you look at the local economy here in Silver Bow County, and more specifically, you look at this list of industries here, and you ask the question, are these industries more or less prominent here than, shall we say, the average economy, whatever that means? More specifically, if I take the share of the economy, in this case earnings, for each of these industries, the percentage share it makes of the total economy, and I compare that share locally to the share of the national economy, so the overall average, if that ratio is equal to 1, it says you're exactly average. So my first one is mining. Guess what? You're not exactly average in mining, right? In fact, this says that your mining industry is more than 13 times more prominent in terms of its composition, what share it makes up of your full economy, than the overall economy. That bar at 1 is our metric, and with mining being so large, it makes it a little hard to see, but your eye is kind of drawn to those that are past 1. I'll read those in a second. But of course, not every, this isn't Lake Wobegon, we're not all above average, all right? So some are smaller than average and some are more. So a couple of ones, except for mining, let's get past that one. It's a beautiful place, and so accommodations in food and retail trade to some extent reflect the importance of the visitor industry here. And you can also see, which is quite typical of the urbanized areas in Montana, a little extra prominence to healthcare, because people come here for healthcare, and that's important. Other ones, just not as prominent, manufacturing, construction, you can see. But so I'm not saying the other industries aren't important, but when you're trying to figure out how the economy is going to do, you're drawn towards the big movers and shakers. The one not on this list, of course, is utilities, which is a huge piece of the economy. It just so happens that the utility information is actually is suppressed by the government to protect the confidentiality. I'm not supposed to know how many people Northwestern employs, although John just told me. They don't really care. They'll let you know. So look at the economy a different way. I've been talking about employment and earnings, and that's great. Those are numbers you can kind of relate to. There's also another way of looking at economic activity, and that's to use the same kind of information that we use for the national economy. You hear a lot about this GDP. The U.S. economy grew by X%. That's GDP. What is GDP? Essentially, it's an output-based measure. More specifically, it's value-added. It rewards activities which produce a lot of output more than activities which have, shall we say, a high head count. So a mechanized industry like the mining industry, or like an oil refinery, or just as an example, would be something that had a big kick in GDP, maybe not quite as big as employment. So this is just a new way of looking at it. If I look at what happened in Montana, it looks like this. And it's a story that goes down instead of across, I know that. And it's a story, though, that is consistent with what I said this morning, of there being a slowdown in 22. Remember, I showed you that earnings data. What happens when I put Butte-Silver Bow in? Well, my goodness, it's moving all over the place, mostly because of what's going on in mining. All right? So you saw a huge, actually 2020 was 0, it doesn't even show up. But yeah, did we have a slowdown in 22? Oh, yes, we did. All right. Of course, this is on the production side. It doesn't always translate into jobs and earnings locally, but it's interesting to look at. if you look at it with coarse lenses, it's a slowdown. Of course, it's from a big boom to a big negative. So it's going to have some volatility here. This is really going to be dominated by MR, quite frankly, is really what's going to move this number. I told you we looked at employments, and of course you kind of know the story, right? I mean, it's been strong at the airport, maintained market share, and a lot of airports are dealing with this, of course. And this is a way of looking at employments, though, and to look at the recovery of employments from the depths of COVID. So each of these numbers is a monthly count of employments at the local airport relative to that same month in 2019. So you can see that in the depths of the pandemic, you could hear the sound of crickets in the airport, right? I mean, they were empty, but there was a pretty impressive recovery. 2020, as you can see, 22 and the end of 22 and into 23 have been a more difficult time, and the net result is you're standing at about 60% here locally than where you were in 20, and that stands in contrast to the rest of Montana. Of course, I mean, there's so many airports your size and Helena and even Billings that are dealing with the new Colossus just down the road, right? That has gazillions of direct flights, and this is stealing their passenger traffic, no question about it. And I'm not sure what's going to change that. It's been an interesting pattern in your migration. I noted in Montana that it had been tapering off. Here in Butte-Silver Bow, there's no sign of that. Now, one change is that I have an extra data point for the state that I don't have for the counties. So I don't have census data on 23 migration, possibly it did taper off. But you can see it's been very impressive. Predating COVID, quite frankly. And this has really moved the needle. More people moving here on net. It adds to the vitality of the economy. It adds to demand for housing. There's a lot of changes that happen with that. So, this is kind of a tradition, these outlooks, right? I mean, 49 years, we're doing this outlook. What will we be doing 49 years from now, right? Yeah, I don't know. It'd probably be a robot out there talking to you, right? But robot or human, they might put up some version of this graph. This is the famed BBER thermometer graph trying to see what drives the local economy, local in this case, Silver County. And to put this together, first off, I will say that just simply as someone that's given countless talks like this, if you ever show a list of industries, right, in front of a live audience, and your industry is not on the list, you're not happy campers, all right? So let me tell you why you might not be on this list. Well, a lot of you probably are. First, we take the economy and we divide it into two pieces, drivers and followers, all right? Drivers of any economy are those sectors that bring in revenue from outside. So their growth is not limited by the growth of the county, the local economy. Followers are economic industries, activities that grow and shrink as the economy does. So, classic example of a driver, as Butte, it's going to be mining, it's going to be tourism to some extent. You'll see the list in a second. What's not on the list, the followers may be larger. All right, local public schools would be a classic example, right? I mean, it's going to grow and shrink as the rest of the economy, and specifically school-aged population. So here's the list. What drives the economy? Well, 29% of the drivers are mining. We have Montana Tech as an important driver here. We have utilities as an important driver, 14%. Manufacturing, travel, federal government presence, and some other sector I mentioned, healthcare as being an industry that does pull people from outside the region. So what we try to do with the industries on this list is try to understand what kind of year we expect them to have. Not because we like them better or anything, but because they tend to be good predictors of how the overall economy is going to do. So let's look at the recent performance of the economy. Let me go to this earnings number, which is the number I told you is a little out of date, only through 22, but fairly comprehensive. And you can see that the volatility in mining was actually a plus in '22. It stands out as having, significant earnings growth. Some of the other industries are a bit more challenged. But remember, this is '22 coming off a gigantic '21. So this looks like, it's kind of a malaise. Not really. I mean, there's been quite a bit of growth here locally. And this just says relative to that boom year, some of these industries had difficulty keeping up. So accommodations and food, I would argue, had a pretty good year. But it came off a spectacular year in '21. And you can see that a little more when I add this stuff up and I switch over to wages and salary employment, which is much more recent, a little less comprehensive. And there you can see, if you look really hard, you can see a little bit of a slowdown, but not much. It looks like pretty steady growth coming out of the pandemic, particularly in total wages. And of course, total wages are going to be a little more volatile because some of the mining fluctuations are going to show up in money more than they're going to show up in employment. So this is a good point in our economic cycle to do a little assessment of where do we stand on economic growth, particularly coming through this pandemic with the decline and the recovery. And let's frame this in terms of probably the easiest economic statistic to comprehend, and that's jobs, right? So let's do a job count and say, have we recovered from the pandemic, or more accurately, how much have we recovered? And let's do this for this industry list you can see on the bottom of this graph. So our reference point is going to be this 100. That's where we were, that's where construction was before the pandemic. What did construction do at the very worst of the pandemic? And where is construction now with jobs being our measure? And you can see that construction was hardly impacted at all by the pandemic. And that's pretty easy to understand. I mean, outdoor jobs, maybe a little disruption, but by and large, not much change. And there's been a significant improvement in construction employment here locally for a lot of reasons. For housing reasons, commercial development, some industrial building. What's going on in these other industries is quite different now. And I don't necessarily have explanations for all these, but I'll do my best. Okay? There's been a lot of port activity. I think that's the big information that's happening in transportation, where that situation has clearly changed. There's been some expansions. Way over on the right is accommodations and food, which has probably the most dramatic slowdown, which makes sense. That was the hotel industry, which created, and so forth. And it's come back pretty strongly. But in terms of employment, we're back to where we were pre-pandemic. But some evidence of retail, and you can read the rest. Healthcare, as I said, it's been a challenging period for healthcare, particularly hospitals. I was telling you, those job counts for hospitals, very much challenged by labor market issues. All right, so you can see that showing up as well. So it's a bit of a mixed report card, but it gives you a little bit of a feeling of where we stand coming up over this span of time of 3.5 years. So let's look at the forecast. The forecast for Butte-Silver Bow, when we came here last year, we saw this big reopening happening here, as it happens in so many places in the state. Really strong growth, particularly by historical standards here, over 5%. Big slowdown in 22, and we said it would be negative in 23. Now what do we know? Wow, that was revised out. 9.5% of Butte-Silver Bow is a giant number, and it's really huge. It's still that same trend, but a little bit of improvement in the forecast, and then you outperform our forecast, not by a lot, but it's consistent with more of a slowdown in 23. So what are we saying for 24? Well, we're on trend growth, and we're never popular when we tell you what your trend growth is. But that's what we see as a trend growth. This is in real terms. I think there's some reasons why this could be too low, but let me tell you a little bit why we say this, all right? One of the reasons why we say this is because we're looking at a state economy that's growing as trend growth. We're looking at consumers that have less money to spend. We're looking at commodity prices that are a little weak. And we're looking at the healthcare industry that still struggles to expand because of its problems in the labor market. So that's my, not exactly an applause line last slide. And happy to take some food questions.
One question that might come up, Pat, when you talked about projected, earlier in the program you talked about the need for copper.
Yes.
For all the EV stuff that's coming and that. And that would tell me mining should be a rock star, right, going forward?
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, that's if we meet our stated goals, right? I mean, we actually have to recommit to actually do all the things to get there. But certainly, on more of an 8 or 10-year horizon, the future is very bright for, as I said this morning, Big Show.
Yeah. Good. Other questions for Pat?